The European Theater of Operations. United States Army was a United States Army formation which directed U.S. Army operations in parts of Europe from 1942 to 1945. It referred to Army Ground Forces, United States Army Air Forces, and Army Service Forces operations north of Italy and the Mediterranean coast. In the European theatre of World War II, it was bordered to the south by the North African Theatre of Operations, U.S. Army, which later became the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. The term Theatre of Operations was defined in the U.S. Army field manuals as the land and sea areas to be invaded or defended, including areas necessary for administrative activities incident to the military operations. In accordance with the experience of World War I, it was usually conceived of as a large landmass over which continuous operations would take place and was divided into two chief areas: the combat zone, or the area of active fighting, and the communications zone, or area required for administration of the theater. As the armies advanced, both these zones and the areas into which they were divided would shift forward to new geographic areas of control. History. British-American military staffs agreed during their meetings in Washington in January-March 1941 to exchange military missions to facilitate planning for the eventuality of American entry in the war. Major General James E. Cheney, an Army Air Corps officer, arrived in the United Kingdom on 18 May 1941, and on the following day, Headquarters, Special Observer Group, was established in London. SBOPS also had the role of studying British use of Lend-Lease supplies. His formal title was the Special Army Observer in the United Kingdom and head of SPOBS. After the United States entered the war, SPOBS was succeeded by United States Army Forces in the British Isles, actually SPOBS under a new name. At the time of the Arcadia Conference, December 1941 January 1942, the decision was made to place the Magnet Forces under the command of Maj. Gen. E. L. Daly, and make him in turn responsible to General Cheney, designated as CG, USA FBI. Lt. Gen. John C. H. Lee became Chief, Services of Supply, U.S. Army Forces British Isles, and later Deputy Theatre Commander, ETO USA. On June 8, 1942, the United States Department of War officially established ETO USA in its place. Its mission was to conduct planning for the eventual retaking of Europe and to exercise administrative and operational control over U.S. forces. The 133rd Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division was the first United States Army unit sent to Europe in World War II. The 1st Battalion arrived in Belfast in late January 1942, followed by the rest of the regiment in February. These units were designated as U.S. Army Northern Ireland Forces, later incorporated within the European Theatre of Operations. The 133rd and 168th Infantry Regiments trained in the peat bogs, and performed border guard patrols between British Northern Ireland and the neutral Irish Free State. The remaining unit of the division, the 135th Infantry Regiment, arrived in May 1942. From February 1944 the operational command was the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which as an Allied command also had operational control of British and all other Allied land forces and tactical air forces in the European theatre. Until SHAEF was operational, ETO USA liaised closely with the British in the planning and organizing of Operation Overlord. U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had multiple command appointments. He replaced Cheney in late June 1942, but in November he also commanded the Allied forces in Operation Torch through AFHQ. He then relinquished command of ETO USA to Lt. Gen. Frank M. Andrews in February 1943, who was killed in an air crash in May. He was replaced by Lt. Gen. Jacob L. Devas, former chief of the Armored Force. In December 1943 it was announced that Eisenhower would be Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. In January 1944 he resumed command of ETO USA and the following month was officially designated as the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. Was the headquarters of the Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, whereas the AFHQ was the headquarters of only the Allied forces. He served in a dual role until the end of hostilities in Europe in May 1945. From February 1944, SHAEF was the operational command and ETO USA administrative command. Some units were transferred between operational commands and administrative commands at different times. For example, the American 6th Army Group, which was set up under the Mediterranean Theater of Operations to oversee Operation Dragoon. The invasion of southern France between Toulon and Caen was passed to SHAEF a month after the invasion, which took place on August 15, 1944. By the end of 1944, Eisenhower, through SHAEF, commanded three powerful Allied army groups. In the North, British 21st Army Group commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In the Middle, the American 12th Army Group commanded by General Omar N. Bradley, and in the South, the American 6th Army Group commanded by Devas. The British 21st Army Group and French elements of the 6th Army Group were not part of ETO USA, but by that stage of the war most of the operational forces under the command of SHAEF were American. The ETO USA planning staff in London was usually referred to by its Army Post Office number, APO 887. After the war in Europe ended, ETO USA became briefly U.S. Armed Forces Europe, then U.S. Forces, European Theater, and then, eventually, United States Army Europe. Campaigns and operations. Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, involving the 9th, 3rd Infantry and the 2nd Armored Divisions, initiated on November 8, 1942, was the first ground combat operations for the United States in World War II. Albert Cody Wedemeyer was chief author of the Victory Program, published 3 months before the U.S. entered the war in 1941, which advocated the defeat of the German armies on the European continent. When the U.S. entered the war after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941 and the U.S. was at war with both Japan and Germany, Europe First, a modified version of his plan was adopted by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Under the German First policy, the plan was expanded to include the blueprint for the Normandy landings. List of air operations during the Battle of Europe: September 1, 1939, May 7, 1945. Normandy Campaign, June 6, 1944, July 24, 1944. Northern France Campaign, July 25, 1944, September 14, 1944. Southern France Campaign, Rhineland Campaign, Lorraine Campaign, September 1, 1944, December 18, 1944. Ardennes-Alsace Campaign, December 16, 1944, January 25, 1945. Central Europe Campaign, March 22, 1945, May 11, 1945.